All right, so GW just dropped a weird midweek rules update and points update and blah 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 blah. Everyone's excited about points and stuff, but of course we're on our own thing over here, finding the weird stuff. So what'd you find?
That's my job, is the weird stuff. I understand. So here's my issue. I understand I find one weird, dumb thing and go way too deep on what this means. We got a single FAQ answer for Space Wolves. There's two technically, but one of them was whatever. This one that you can see here asks if you have a Space Wolves unit, so you're playing Space Wolves, can you take a biologist at all? Period. Doesn't talk about detachment, doesn't talk about anything. The answer is just hard no. Well, this is confusing on a couple of levels, but the confusing part is what it implies. So if we go to the Space Wolves detachment that we currently have, and this is index, to be clear, so it probably could use some cleaning up, but it's fine. We'll get to that in a minute. Biologist isn't technically on here, but Apothecary is, and I believe at one point there was a clarification about the Biologist was intended to be on here. Apothecary is a keyword. We all know what you meant. Okay, cool, that's fine. And for the entirety of the edition so far, we've all been playing with, okay, this is a Space Wolf detachment. If you're playing this detachment, here are the restrictions. This is one rules block worth of text, right? And this goes exactly against what I tell people to do, which is to like read rules separately, but we all treated this as one. Well, that all makes a lot of sense, but the question that was answered of can't take biologist period, regardless of detachment, implies some things. The first is that this restrictions block is a separate rule of text from the detachment. Because if they say that Space Wolves cannot take these units across the board period all the time, well, what does that really mean for us? Because this is this is within our detachment, but it's applying to the faction as a whole. If that's true,
Right.
Does that then mean that this separate rule of text restrictions and the top line of text that says this faction is takeable by Adeptus Astartes are totally separate? If that's true, that means that in theory, I could be playing the new Blood Angels Codex using the Champions of Rust detachment. Wild.
Oh, I see.
It's a problem.
Kind of weird, but
Yep. So there's one counter argument here before we explore this any further that is somewhat fair, and that is to say, because they had to errata this to add the biologist specifically, instead of just saying like, oh, it's the keyword apothecary, that when they added the biologist to this text block, they're making a wholly separate ruling of, because we said we forgot to add biologist here, but it's in an FAQ, well, now you can't take biologist anywhere, and it's special and separate, which might be true. In the case that that's true, first off, that's confusing and dumb and kind of unnecessary. But putting all that aside, it still doesn't really matter. The statement or question that I'm posing here still stands, because all that really did was get me to look at this harder. And now that I've taken a step back and looked at it harder, I still kind of argue that there's a whole lot of the use of the word can.
Yeah,
and there's very little of the use cannot. Because the argument here is definitely still, whether this restrictions block of text is a part of this detachment or not, the answer is I could definitely play Ultramarines in this detachment. Maybe, if this is the same block of text, I could play Ultramarines, couldn't play Space Wolf units because I can't have more than one chapter, but I could play Guilliman, but I wouldn't be allowed to take Assault Squads or Devastators with Guilliman in this detachment. So whether this rules,
you could use Champions of Rust, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So whether or not we make the argument that this is a Space Wolf detachment or not, or whether or not this restriction is attached to the detachment or attached to wolves, the short answer is definitely we have been misinterpreting who can use what detachments from the beginning.
Yeah, I see it. I get you.
So the obvious answer here is, well, okay, so if we look at, let's just start with this route, I guess. If we look at the updated codexes, right, because this is a Snowflake chapter problem. In Dark Angels, this is a Dark Angels detachment, their restriction is basically worded the same. Here's your detachment rule. The restriction is you can include Dark Angels units, but you can't include other chapters. Again, clearly indicating that I could play Raven Guard with Raven Guard named character in this Dark Angels detachment and gain cool benefit. Just cause. Like, that's the only restriction. There's not even like a unit restriction other than can use Dark Angels, can't have multiple chapters, is definitely in a Astartes detachment. So moving further, going to the next one here, well, Blood Angels just released. What gets even funnier to me is that you've got like this army rule and detachment of the detachment no longer says it has a restriction at all. Like this Liberators Assault group, which everyone, at least in our group, is, talking about for Blood Angels, it has no restrictions. Even if you look back, a page prior onto the army rules to where it kind of tells you about like all the detachments prior to getting into them specifically, it still talks about like, if you have Blood Angels and Astartes, you count as Blood Angels. You can't have more than one chapter per detachment or army. And like, there's nothing here saying that I can't take this Liberators Assault group and play it as Space Wolves and get a bunch of charge bonuses on all of my Space Wolves.
Yeah. This is
crazy.
Weird. Yeah, I definitely don't think it's how it's intended, but also they did leave a door open here.
You're right, and the problem is they're effectively contradicting themselves, because if we go back to when the reason this initial question was ever asked, it is because in GW's official app, there was a previous update when we had the big giant change a while back.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the Biologist wasn't takeable by Space Wolves in any detachment. And everyone was like, oh, they just did this giant update. It's clearly a mistake. There was like a coding thing, whatever, right? Like, as much as we want to complain about their app, the answer is it's still better than the previous one. So, like, it's fine. We'll let it go. No big deal. I know at least in our play group, I had 3 different people, including myself, that all sent like error reports inside the app saying, why can't we take the Biologist? It's not showing up at all in any detachment, regardless of, because if you select Space Wolves, it just stops showing up. And this also applied to like the regular Apothecary. Well, we all assume the restrictions on the Space Wolf detachment when you select Space Wolves as your faction gains access to that detachment, and then the restrictions of that detachment were accidentally applying to every detachment.
Right.
Well, if that's true, that's a fairly simple answer, right? Like, oh, it's a coding thing, no big deal. Well, this answering the question this way, the way they did today, specifically says it wasn't an accident, it was intentional. Okay, well, if that was intentional and the app was right, we were wrong, that's totally fair. Well, then, if you read the rules as they're written, now all of these detachments are takeable by everybody. Why does the app not let my Space Wolves take the Blood Angels detachment?
Right.
Like, it's one thing to say, oh, we had an accidental like error in our app, but what we meant. You have a printed book. The book says you're correct. Just follow the book. And then when they say no, the app was correct the whole time, ignore the book. Well, now, like, why buy a codex if the book isn't even right? And why would I pay for an app that is technically correct, but it's not using the codex rules? It's like its own set of rules. So what do we follow?
Yeah, the The what takes precedence for errata needs an errata.
It's yes. And there was a bunch of changes today, and I'm sure you're going to see like 30 videos on it, and all sorts of people talking on your forums and discords and things like that. There's a bunch of changes, and a lot of those changes are crazy good and fun and interesting, and there's a bunch to talk about. And I'm over here like panicking in my own little world about this single FAQ question and how every Space Marine player has been self-restricting themselves for no reason, according to GW.
Yeah. Well,
there's the obvious answer here that I hope will end up being the case, that whoever answered this question on GW's behalf made a mistake, and they will do another FAQ effectively changing the answer to this FAQ question, and then hopefully updating their app. And then we'll all go back to believing in what we believed in the first place.
Yeah. By the way, this is just a small side note. When they update the app and you haven't updated it yet, it pretends like you don't have a subscription until you update it.
Which is true?
Yeah,
I haven't noticed.
Yeah. I mean, you might be like auto updating it, so you won't notice.
Yeah.
But if you have it to like only manually updating, you'll be like, what the heck? I'm logged in and I definitely paid. Don't pay again. Update your app first. I don't know if that's intentional or what, but
it
look out for that.
Is like I'm not actually giving GW a hard time for trying to like convince people to update the app and whatever else. Like there's actually some reasonable arguments of like, no, but if you force them to update the app, then you prevent like rules arguments of like, but your app's outdated and whatever else, and the only way to like force them to update is
and also like I don't have to inspect your phone to see if your app's up to date. It just will stop working unless it's up to date. That kind of makes sense. It's fine.
I don't love that. Obviously, that's rather annoying, especially when like those of us that like to go to tournaments. There's Blood Angels just released, and we were like, the fact that if it releases at a certain time and your tournament is too close to that, they'll say, no, you have to use the old rules. So like when we were at Nova, Imperial Agents, I intentionally didn't update my app because if I use the Assassin, I have to use the old one. Have to. So like I intentionally didn't update for that specific event.
I know it's too much to ask, but it'd be kind of nice if they let you roll back the rules to like the last couple updates, especially for the tournaments that have cutoff dates like that. Anyway, I digress. Thanks for listening to our nonsense.